Having said that, I haven't read all of my advisor's books either. So. Alas, finally, yes. Asia during and after the Mongol conquest. More specifically, East Asia in this lecture. Last lecture, we kind of looked at South Asia as well, India. Here, I'll focus more on the Mongol conquest of China. I think I alluded to at the end of last time how the Mongols actually take up the mandate of heaven and proclaim themselves to be a new dynasty. We'll talk about that dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and how it's relatively short-lived, but it is replaced by a dynasty that is not short-lived, that lasts quite a while, the Ming dynasty, and that will set us up to talk about the very last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty. But first, the exploits of the Mongols. We've been building up to this for some weeks now. Their origins are in the Gobi Desert. So, here is China proper. Mongolia, Gobi Desert is up here, northwest of China proper. So these Mongols are the latest and greatest of the nomadic horseback warriors to ride out of the Central Asian steppe region, the high, flat grasslands of Central Asia. Similar in origin in that regard to the Xiongnu and some others we've talked about. A pastoral people living there in outer Mongolia and loosely organized tribal society, grazing cattle. Living in and around that Gobi Desert in dwellings called yurts. These are portable little round huts that are made of light wood and skins that could easily be broken down, transported on horseback or pack animals, and thrown up relatively quickly. So ideal for the pastoral nomadic lifestyle. Their great leader Temujin would, from these humble beginnings, build an empire the likes of which the world had never seen. Using his powerful personality and his visions of military conquest to unite the tribes and to eventually proclaim himself to be the universal ruler, or Genghis Khan. Through taxation and compulsory military service, Genghis Khan builds an army of some 130,000, which is not historically enormous, but is effective enough, particularly when you consider that Mongol warriors mastered the art of horse-mounted archery. And Genghis Khan himself was quite the military strategist and quite adept at military operations, as you would say. This would be the level of maneuvering below grand strategy and above what we would call tactics. So for example, the Mongols would lead flying columns and attack an enemy briefly. This would be like a small detachment, very swift, mobile detachment that would go and briefly attack an enemy and then withdraw. This would lure the enemy out into a waiting siege of the much larger Mongol army. Or in defending against a cavalry attack, they would place prisoners or auxiliary forces in a sort of soft middle and keep their own forces in the wings in order to envelop an enemy. This makes me think immediately of what Hannibal did at Cannae, if you'll recall, against the Romans. Let the center sink in, let your best troops envelop the army as it sort of is pulled into the middle. Mongol armies were highly disciplined at a time when a lot of others were large and relatively unorganized or undisciplined. In a sense, you could argue that they invented the blitzkrieg-style attack long before German commanders in the 20th century did. Blitzkrieg being the German term for lightning war. Strike lightning fast and with pinpoint accuracy. Let's talk about the early Mongol conquest then. Oh, there you have pictures of some yurts. this lecture because I'm like, oh, I remember that slide. So the Mongols began subduing fellow tribal groups around them in the early 1200s, early 13th century, when Genghis Khan rises to become the universal supreme ruler. This would include the Khitan people that we talked about last time, in the outer reaches of China. And then, of course, they turn their attention, first, before China proper, to the non-Chinese kingdoms of northern China, like in Manchuria. This is where they encountered for the first time gunpowder weapons, what were essentially like fire lances, if you will, the prototypes of what would become guns. Now, some Mongol armies stayed to keep pressing on into China proper. Others headed west in the 1220s and 1230s. Conquered all of Central Asia, conquered Persia, as you know, made it as far as Russia, and might have conquered Russia too had it not been for the onset of winter and the death of Genghis Khan. You know that they attacked the Delhi Sultanate in India, but did not fully conquer it. They did, of course, as we alluded to, sack the Abbasid capital of Baghdad in 1258, destroying it in an incredibly brutal assault, allowing them to take control of all of Mesopotamia. And then Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, finally defeated the Song dynasty in China in 1279, putting China under foreign rule. Now, the Mongols always gave enemies a chance to join the empire and submit to the rule of the Khan, but if you didn't, the alternative was annihilation. There was sort of no mercy, no quarter given if you chose the path of resistance. Genghis Khan himself took personal delight in sacking or destroying cities, leveling buildings, destroying irrigation systems in the countryside so there would be famines and people would die long after the assault. He undertook various means of horrific torture. When they did sack a city like Baghdad, typically most of the men were killed, and there was then the systematic rape of the women. When they took Baghdad, they executed the caliph, the Abbasid caliph, by trampling him with their horses, because it was considered bad to spill noble blood. With your own hand, as it were. I mean, to trample somebody with horses is a whole other matter. They would do things like pour molten silver over your eyes and ears. After the siege there at Baghdad, too, the toll was something on the order of somewhere between 200,000 and perhaps as many as 1 million civilians. They destroyed libraries, hospitals, mosques, palaces. Hulagu Khan, the ruler there, had to move the capital north due to the stench of death coming out of the city. Similarly, the sack of Urgench in Persia, total destruction, mass execution of the entire population, 100,000 plus people, and so on. Some regions lost as much as a third of their population due to the conquest and the subsequent starvation brought about by the destruction of irrigation systems and such. Combine this too with the fact that the Mongols are also probably responsible, albeit inadvertently, for bringing the bubonic plague to Europe. That would decimate that continent's population by about a third in the 1300s, as we will see. We'll have, of course, talk about that in lecture, and we'll have a film on that as well. Now, they did finally settle down, had to change the very nature of their society, of course, but they could not continue on indefinitely as pastoral nomads. Genghis Khan had tried to maintain that way of life, but when he died, things changed. aristocrats taking up positions and administering the empire, commoners taking up sedentary agriculture, becoming merchants. Also, when Genghis Khan died, following the tribal custom, his empire is divided up among his sons and grandsons into 4 khanates. Somewhat analogous to the splitting of the empire of Alexander and the Greeks into the Hellenistic kingdoms. The 4 khanates under autonomous rule of the progeny of Genghis Khan. You've got Chengadai in Central Asia, the capital thereof being Samarkand, which we visited on Google Earth last time, you'll recall, the Registan, and from which Tamerlane would later build the Timurid dynasty. We talked about Tamerlane last time. So in Central and South Asia, we kind of got ahead of ourselves a little bit in that last lecture. And there's Persia, which actually encompassed Mesopotamia as well. So a combined khanate of Persia and Mesopotamia with a capital at Baghdad. And then there's the khanate of Kipchak, or the Golden Horde, which included portions of eastern Russia. And then there is the sort of home khanate of Great Khan in Mongolia, but also including China. This is the map of the khanates here. So you've got Great Khan, which includes the homelands, Mongolia, Gobi Desert, plus China. China, big picture. Note that this includes Tibetan Plateau and much of what was Xinjiang province. West of that, Chengadai with the capital at Samarkand. That's the sort of Central Asian khanate. Persia and Mesopotamia, the Ilkhanate, also known as. And then above that, Golden Horde, which stretches into, actually, southern Russia proper and to the doorstep of Europe. Largest empire the world had ever seen, but short-lived, as we'll see. Now, having said that, there is some success in Mongol rule in China. Perhaps not quite as much as Kublai Khan would have liked. Kublai Khan attempted, as the ruler of Great Khan there, to extend Mongol rule into Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, or into Korea or Japan, with no success. So there were limits on Mongol expansion. Now, they fared much better at ruling China itself. As I alluded to earlier, they claimed to have taken up the mandate of heaven, and that had been lost by the Song dynasty. This shows you the power of Chinese institutions. The foreign people would come in and rule over China, but nonetheless adopt this principle. They also retained the general government structure of the administrative state in China with a civilian branch, a military branch, and then that censorate branch of imperial censors that would travel throughout the empire, sort of keeping tabs on everything. They also kept the civil service examination system. And though Kublai Khan himself was a Buddhist, he maintains Confucianism as the state religion. So, mandate of heaven, general government structure, civil service examination system, Confucianism. In other words, the program of study, generally speaking, for the civil service exams would still be the Confucian classics. The Mongols, of course, had their own culture and continued to practice for themselves their own religion, but they did not impose that upon China. And having said that, too, the Chinese, for their part, had to at least respect the stability and the economic prosperity that came along with Mongol rule. Consider that the Mongols, for at least this century or so, controlled like the entire damn Silk Road. And when you have that kind of stability, trade is very clearly going to thrive between East Asia and Central Asia and Europe. You have one people, one empire, albeit broken down into these 4 khanates, but coordinating together at least. and at peace, and trade can and certainly did thrive. And there's also a sort of relative tolerance of local rule and local custom under the Mongols too, brutal as their conquests were. The Yuan also expanded the Great Canal from the Yellow River up to their new capital of Khanbalik. Remember, the capital of China for a long time had been at Chang'an or Xi'an. Then it moves north to Khanbalik. Khanbalik is the site of modern-day Beijing, which is the capital of China to this day. They also built a road to run alongside the canal. It's important in terms of trade, censorate imperial dispatch, mobility of the army, and so on. But that capital at Khanbalik was said by Marco Polo, an Italian merchant who actually lived there for a quarter of a century, to be quite marvelous indeed. Marco Polo is not the first European to go to East Asia, but he's the first to leave a detailed record or account of his travels. He travels far and wide with his father and uncle, who had met Kublai Khan remarkably before on their own travels, and had been asked, again remarkably, by Kublai Khan to deliver a letter to the Pope in Rome and to return with oil from the lamp of Jerusalem. 3.5 years after leaving Europe and surviving a bandit raid on the Silk Road, maybe I made too much of it, all safe and prosperous it was, they delivered. And Kublai Khan is delighted and wanted them to stay and be advisors at his royal court, which they did for 24 years. Quite the life, that. And when Marco Polo returns and pens an account of his travels, this gives Europeans a glimpse into the magnificence of Chinese society, which, beyond the trade goods that came into Europe up to that point, would have been for the first time. Many were skeptical, and perhaps quite rightly so, but many people were fascinated by this, including the Genoese explorer who would later sail for Spain, Christopher Columbus. Who had a copy of Marco Polo's account with handwritten notes in it. So we know he was quite taken by it. Now, what about the decline of the Yuan? Of course, it's going to sound like the decline of every other empire or dynasty we've looked at. Excessive spending on failed military campaigns that I mentioned earlier. Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan. A famine in the 1340s. Difficulty transitioning from that nomadic way of life to a more sedentary one in cities and villages. Of course, the splitting of the empire. In China itself, in Yuan China, Kublai Khan's successors lacked his skill in administration and leadership. And then eventually a series of peasant uprisings, which would eventually lead to the overthrow of the Yuan in 1369 under the leadership of a man named Zhu Yangzhou, who proclaims a new dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, with himself ruling as the Hongwu Emperor. Ming Dynasty begins in 1369, and lasts into the mid-17th century. So nearly 300 years of Ming dynastic rule, and a period of profound stability and advancement and extension of the empire into Mongolia, into Central Asia, including the strengthening of the Great Wall to the north and the pacification of nomadic peoples beyond, the reconquest of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the placing of Korea, forcing of Korea yet again into a tributary status, a reinvigoration of Confucianism, the three-branch system of government that we talked about, under which 6 ministries of governance, and you don't have to know these, but including personnel, revenue, rights, R-I-T-E, rights, war, punishments, and works. Reinvigoration of the civil service examination system. Reinvigoration of the province, district, county structure of governance. Allowing villages to have local councils of elders to handle local affairs, mediate disputes, initiate what we call internal improvements or construction and irrigation projects, and organize militia and collect taxes and so on. All of that to say, a sophisticated bureaucratic state. Now, of course, there was no church-state split in China, and partly because there is no institutionalized church at all. But the state does take responsibility for people's moral well-being. Consider that as the obligation of possessing the mandate of heaven. The well-being of not just the people writ large, of each and every person's spiritual well-being. Quite the responsibility of that. The emperor himself had to be diligent and not too strict, but also not too lenient. He had to honor principles and values, and above all, here's a key, tradition. One of the key principles of Confucianism is the honoring, the veneration, the commitment to tradition. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind anytime from henceforth we talk about China, particularly vis-a-vis or in relation to Europe. Now, the Ming emperors, their rule was exemplary of sort of European-style absolute monarchy, as we'll see. The emperor was considered the son of heaven, and China the celestial empire. In previous dynasties, this was not necessarily so. The emperor had not always been the sole locus of authority. There had been certain ministers, perhaps eunuchs and others, who had shared important power. Not so under the Ming. Now, this is interesting because if you have a particularly adept or effective individual who inherits that imperial throne, this can be a great form of governance, and it can also be bad if you get somebody who's, not so great, who's mentally unstable or not so smart or just not generally an effective leader and so on. So it's a gamble style of government, which worked out for the Ming, of course, for the better part of 300 years. China, though, the celestial empire, celestial meaning heavenly. In such a concept, Earth is the center of the universe, and China is the center of the earth. China, in essence, is the center of it all. And the emperor himself is the son of heaven, the ruler of all on earth. Other rulers of other peoples, whether they'd submitted as tributary states or not, were considered little brothers to the son of heaven. And those who had accepted tributary status, like Korea, they would send diplomats with tribute to come and to kowtow before the emperor. Anybody visiting the emperor's court had to come and kneel and bow and touch their head and their hands to the floor. To honor the emperor, acknowledge his status as the son of heaven, and thereby to acknowledge China's status as the celestial empire, as the center of it all. During this time, the Yongle emperor, who we'll talk more about in just a moment, moves the capital back to what had become Beijing, greetings, wherein the so-called Forbidden City was constructed. Nearly 1,000 buildings spanning 180 acres, pictured at top right. What a kick-ass photograph. You have entered, my son, at the precise moment where for the first time today I will take us to our favorite place of exploration. And by our, I mean my, which when I'm in charge constitutes our, right?
That's true.
It is pleasing to me, therefore we must do it. So we will fly up from Social Circle and west. There's Japan and Korea. Here's Beijing. So just for reference sake, Xi'an/Chang'an down here, Beijing up here. So note that when they expand the Great Canal, that's a pretty hefty expansion all the way up here to Beijing. Which, by the way, Tianjin is a massive city too, and so this is one of those areas in the world nowadays that's like a gigantic population center. Same could be said down here of Guangzhou and Shenzhen, Macau and Hong Kong, port cities for Europeans later, so that's neither here nor there. Let us, though, descend upon the Forbidden City. Can I find it without looking for it? It should be right in the middle, yeah. There's Tiananmen Square, which would be important if we were in my World II class and looking at 20th century events. There's gates to the Forbidden City. Looks like nobody's getting in there right now.
It's forbidden.
Oh, hey-oh. Normally not, though. Normally totally cool.
It's a little ironic.
Right? It literally is forbidden right now. Hey, people. Oh, there we go. See, Alex, I still fumble around on here. Failing consistently to find best shot.
Hold on.
This is not, this can't be
Yeah.
COVID times, right?
This is pre-COVID.
Yeah, May 2018, so okay. Let's just
Does it say that it feels weird to see a group of people?
no, it's totally true. It really does. It seems
Or to
totally
see a
not
group of
cool.
It's like
people at all.
foreign at this point. Like,
I know.
Do you teach the whole time with your mask cap on?
With my who?
your mask half on.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. This is how I roll, so I can breathe. You know what would make more sense?
Round of applause for Bailey.
Thank you. See, I'm trying to. Yeah, there we go. Got all kinds of cool stuff in there.
Turtle.
Like a dragon turtle. That's a very sophisticated hot take for me. It's like a dragon turtle, man. Various vessels. It was all very glorious, and you know, if you purport to be the Celestial Empire, you ought to be able to construct something that conveys the magnitude of your greatness. There's a money shot. That'd be pretty cold up there. You missed us going to the Bat Shwamanerir and the Hindu temple in Lilburn on Tuesday. That was a fun little visit, wasn't it?
You look pretty cool.
There's a little locomotive in the garden shot for you, a little modern day skyline in the background. I like that a lot right there. Anyway, it's all very glorious indeed. As were the voyages of Zheng-He. How do you like that transition? Under the Yongle Emperor, who I mentioned a moment ago, here we see China playing the European game more than a century before Europeans, and doing it bigger and better. Exploring the seas to China's south and west, far beyond the borders of the empire. Now, they already had excellent navigational knowledge and advanced sailing vessels, much bigger than anything you'd see in Europe then or later. And in the early 15th century, the Emperor Yongle sends his pal Zheng-He, a eunuch at court, on on 7 massive voyages of exploration, including more than 28,000 sailors and 62 ships in the first trip alone. Zheng He is an interesting character. I mentioned he's a eunuch. Have we discussed what that means? Okay, no need to go over that again. That's good. In his case, he was castrated as a reminder of his status as a slave. He'd been taken as a slave from the western reaches out Xinjiang way, a man of mixed ethnicity and cultural background, Central Asian, Muslim, who, as we'll see when we talk later about Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire, oftentimes if you were a prince or favored child in the dynasty, and you would be given a servant at a young age, who was technically a slave, but is also your personal servant, and therefore grows up themselves with a relatively privileged life, a lot of times there's a bond that forms there. Happens with Suleiman and his buddy Ibrahim Pasha, and it happens with the man who would become the Yongle Emperor and Zheng He. So Zheng He is, pals with the emperor, becomes a favored, powerful eunuch, and an admiral, somebody skilled in seafaring and cartography, navigation. And he's put in charge of this most massive sailing expedition the world had ever seen. Or would see, for that matter. Look at that image at bottom center. The massive ship you see would be indicative of the kinds of ships that Zheng He sailed with, and not just one of them. I mentioned we're talking about dozens. In the foreground at bottom left, can you see that other one? That's a caravel. That's what Columbus and other Europeans were sailing with 100 years later. Yeah. Now, needless to say, the caravels had their own advantages. They're much more maneuverable than those gigantic Chinese ships. But still, we have to ask ourselves, what were the purposes of these voyages? And also, where did all the Zheng He go? If you look at this map, shows you the extent of his travels. He's all over the place. I mean, they travel to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, to Siam, or what's now Thailand, Burma, or what's now Myanmar, all over India, down into Indonesia. And look at this. To the Arabian Peninsula, into the Red Sea, as far as Egypt, down here beyond Somalia, down to the city-states of the Muslim coast of East Africa that we talked about in the previous lecture. What's the point, though? What's he doing? These are not voyages of conquest. Although you would think with an army/navy of nearly 30,000 soldiers, it certainly could have been. Also, this is really important, these are not voyages of trade. What incentive would the Chinese have to send out an expedition like this for trade purposes? Does China need to go out looking for trade partners? No. What did we just say about Christopher Columbus being fascinated by Marco Polo? Why does Spain sponsor him to set out on a voyage west to get around the world? Why are the Portuguese trying to get around Africa during the 1400s? These are all things we'll talk about. Because they're trying to get to China, right? You're trying to get to China and India and the Spice Islands. They are falling all over themselves to do this. The Silk Roads have existed for hundreds of years. And the point being, China has no incentive, no need to go out seeking trade connections. Everybody's coming to them. So setting those two aside, it's also, these are not voyages of colonization. They're not sending these 30,000 people out to build settlements and set up shop somewhere. What's the point then? Well, it goes back to this. China is seeking to establish more tributary relationships to further the understanding globally that China is the celestial empire, that the emperor is the son of heaven, and to convince people they should be sending missions of tribute to come and kowtow before the emperor. In an essence, or in another sense, it's spreading the knowledge of the glory and dominance of Chinese civilization. And it was something that the Yongle Emperor was particularly keen on. Curious guy, but also interested in furtherance of the glory of the celestial empire. Does that make sense? it also happens to be something that his successor was not particularly interested in. And do you remember how the film described, and I say this that you might remember because I've used the phrase again after the fact because I like it so much. Do you remember how they described the terracotta army in terms of its cost?
They said like no empire could sustain it.
Yeah, this is one-time thing that Qin Shi Huangdi was so concerned about his soul in the afterlife he didn't really care like how much money it cost. And they describe it as ruinously expensive. You could make the case that insofar as, I should say, these are successful. They build statues to Zheng He like he's a god. From as far away as Egypt and Vietnam and India, they do send tributary missions. So insofar as that was the point, these are successful, and you could probably try to make the case that, hey, what we're getting in tribute could offset some of these costs, right? But the Yongle Emperor's successor determines that they are just that, ruinously expensive, unnecessary. Of course, they did not know that had they continued on these voyages west and rounded the Cape of southern Africa and gotten into the Atlantic Ocean, what might they find? Of course, historians have had fun with this and engaged in what we call counterfactual. And some have made the argument that had these not been discontinued, what do you think might eventually have happened? They discovered the quote-unquote New World, the Western Hemisphere, right? And they would have made that connection, perhaps decades before Columbus accidentally bumped into the Bahamas. We'll never know. In fact, there's one guy who's tried to make the claim that they actually did, but nobody takes that seriously. They might well have, but we'll never know. They're discontinued after the death of the Yongle Emperor, and that was that. Some other things to consider. If this were Europe, and you have the new emperor considering whether to discontinue or continue these, you'd have merchants that were perhaps pushing this ruler to continue these because you would establish perhaps trade connections. Consider the point we made earlier, everybody's coming to China, so there's really no need to do that. Also, merchants, if you remember from a previous lecture, merchants are not exactly venerated in Chinese society. To be a merchant in Chinese society is considered a low occupation. So these are not the people who have the ear of the emperor of people who matter. Consider one final thing, too, vis-a-vis Europe. One thing that you'll consider when we talk about why the Spanish monarchs, Fernando and Isabella, would sponsor a man like Columbus that nobody else took seriously because they knew with the truism that his numbers were wrong and they're going to be blowing their money on this guy, is that they were concerned with sort of keeping up with the Joneses a little bit, trying to keep up with their next door neighbor, Portugal. European nation states are constantly competing with one another to do anything bigger, better, further, what have you. And so that's a lot of what's driving European exploration later. China has no rivals. There's nothing driving them to do anything other than to fall back on tradition, celestial empire, the way we've always done things, everybody's coming to us, and so on. And that serves China well for a long time, until it doesn't. Take my world too, and you'll see the inevitable consequence, maybe not inevitable, you will see the consequence of this centuries later. That all makes sense? Mm-hmm. Decline and fall of the Ming now. I mean, do you want to just guess? I mean, at this point, it's the same 5 or 6 things over and over and over.
Shitty rulers.
Shitty rulers, top of the list. Financial crisis.
Neighboring invaders.
Invasions from nomadic peoples on the outskirts, right? Unrest among the peasantry. Fiscal crisis due to an inflow of silver from European trade. Remember this? It's historically been a trade imbalance, and Europeans will be paying silver instead of trading in kind. It eventually has a sort of inflationary effect. To your point about invading neighbors and keeping them at bay, inability to finance ongoing military campaigns, particularly against the new northern threat. Like every lecture we have, there's a new northern threat. The Xiongnu, and there's the Mongols, and now there's the Manchus, who, just like the Mongols before them, lived on the other side of the Great Wall. And when the Ming have to raise taxes, there is a peasant revolt, and the combined pressure of Manchu invasions and peasant revolt will ultimately beget, it's actually a two-stage process. The peasants overthrow the government, and then they're invaded by and overthrown by the Manchus, who come in and establish themselves as the second outsider people to rule over China and to proclaim themselves a new dynasty, and that in this case is the Qing dynasty, which we'll have to wait for my world too, I guess. I guess we're done with China, remarkable as that may seem. I think so. Do you remember we come back to China? Did we do Qing China? Probably not. You just forgotten it all.
Yeah, I mean, that was like a year ago. I mean, I don't know how you expect me to remember stuff for that long.
I gotta remember it. So I just want to reiterate that point for those of you that do take that class, or just to think about in general. When there is a sustained connection with the West, with Europe specifically, and the Chinese kind of look down on these dirty, backwards outsiders who are trying so hard to get to China and get all these nice things. That's the model for the relationship for a little while, but Europeans are eventually going to get tired of kowtowing, get tired of limitations on where and with whom they can trade and so on, and then they're also going to eventually industrialize. China rejects those changes. It rejects adopting European norms and values and customs and culture and technology. And what does it do? It falls back on tradition. Why wouldn't it? You know, why would they feel compelled to adopt anything from these fractious, backwards people from halfway around the globe? But it bites them in the ass in the long run.
There's no innovation.
Right, correct. And remember, too, one other thing that I mentioned when we very first talked about the civil service examination system, it's great insofar as you have your best and brightest minds working for the government, but it's also bad when your best and brightest minds are working for the government and not innovating and thinking outside the box, right? The best and brightest minds of Europe are at university, right? And engaging in all manner of research and again, innovation. Whereas in China, they're building bridges and, you know, administering the Great Wall and shit, right? So that's a limitation, too, in the long run. Needless to say, much ink has been spilled on these questions. For those who study world history in the broadest sense and write about that, particularly Eurasian history, obviously, this is one of the big questions. Like, how is it possible that China comes to be dominated by Europeans? Like, how the hell does that happen? Why does industrialization happen in Europe and not somewhere else? How in the God's name did it begin in England, of all places? Why not China? Now, there's plenty of answers to this question, and not everyone agrees, of course. I presented you with some of the main points of consideration and arguments. So, questions? All right, well, have a good break. Be safe. Have fun. I didn't slap you with a quiz the minute we get back, did I?
I hope not.
Don't even think about it. Just, you know, check in before the weekend and see where we're at.